There were two brothers, 1, 7, 1, 5. And they were not the best behaved. As a matter of fact, if anything went wrong, you could count on it being these two boys. And the school principal was at her wit's end with these two young boys. And so she called in the local pastor to come and talk to these two boys in her office. And so the pastor calls the first boy in, the 5-year-old, sits him down, and just looks at him from across the desk and says, "Son, where is God?" And the little 5-year-old boy didn't know what to say. So he started squirming in his seat a little bit. And then the pastor said, "Son, I said, where is God?" Again, he's getting really nervous now. He doesn't know what to say. He's squirming. The pastor slams his hand down on the desk and says, "Son, I said, where is God?" And the little boy jumps up, runs down the hall, runs to his brother's classroom and says, "Get your things, we've got to get out of here." And the brother says, "Why? What's happened?" And he said, "I don't know, but God is missing, and they think you and I did something to him." Let's pray. Holy God, we give you thanks. Thanks for the opportunity that we have to come together as a beloved community, to share with each other our joys and our concerns, our laughter and our tears, our happiness and our sadness. We're grateful to have this opportunity to be in this healing place. If even for a moment, it helps us to feel better. We give you thanks for everything that has happened so far, for the presence of the Spirit that we feel in this beautiful space. And now we ask that you be with us as we take a look at some ancient stories. May we hear these stories with our modern ears and be courageous enough to apply them to our lives even today. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. May it be so. Amen. In our first story today, in the threshold moment, we find the disciples still reeling from Jesus' death, this rabbi who they had been following for so long. And they find themselves at a loss of what to do. And so they go back to doing what seems normal. They go back to doing what they were doing when Jesus called many of them in the first place. They go fishing. Because that was their safe space. That was what felt right for them. Jesus comes on the scene and they think they've seen a ghost. And they're wondering what is happening, and they haven't caught anything. And then Jesus tells them, "Cast your nets on the other side," and then they have this big catch of fish. But you notice what Jesus doesn't do in that story? Jesus doesn't rebuke them for going back to doing something that they were familiar with. Jesus doesn't rebuke them for going back and fishing. When it comes to being in need of healing, whether that be spiritual, emotional, or physical, sometimes the most comforting thing we can do is go back to what we know, or to be in a place that makes us feel comfortable, a place where we feel loved. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. Because any of us at any time can find ourselves faced with a situation where we are in need of healing. Think back to before COVID. Remember how everything changed seemingly overnight when we couldn't be close to each other, when we couldn't gather like we used to gather, where even if you went to the grocery store, I don't know about here, but where we were, there were signs on the floor that said 6 feet, 6 feet. You had to stand on those circles when you were in line at the grocery store. I was working in the hospital at the time, and I can remember carrying an iPad around so that people who were very sick with COVID could just communicate with their loved ones because they weren't allowed to visit. How many times during that long period did you say and did I say, I wish we could just go back to the way things were? Because that was what was familiar. And it was scary during the height of the COVID pandemic. And so going back to what used to be felt really good and sounded really good at the time. That's what the disciples experienced when they decided to go out on that boat. And then you have this random story of Jacob that we read in our second reading, where Jacob gets into a battle with some heavenly being and ends up getting his hip broken in the process. And Jacob says, or the being that Jacob is wrestling with says, let me go. And Jacob says, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. Jacob was pretty stubborn. And no, you're not going anywhere until you bless me. And by the end of the story, we find that Jacob is blessed. His name is changed to Israel, and he goes on to father the 12 tribes of Israel. Pretty blessed life. But he was not going to let go. And when I think about some people that I have met in my life that have found themselves in need of healing in some way or another, they are just as stubborn. And they're not going to give up until the healing comes. But where I have to be careful, and I think where all of us have to be careful, is to realize and remember that what healing looks like to me may not be what healing looks like to that person who is stubbornly waiting for the healing. I have been with people when I was doing my chaplaincy work, working toward my degree, where people said they wanted healing, and I thought in my mind what healing meant. But then when I would ask them, how can I pray for you? They asked me to pray something totally different than I was planning to pray. Because the healing that they were looking for was not the same healing that I thought they needed. And that was a lesson for me, to not assume that I know what healing looks like for everyone. And then we get to the last story. The story of the woman that had been bleeding for 12 years. Now, this woman had been really ostracized because of this ailment that she had. Because it would have made her unclean, and so she was not able to worship in the assembly with people in the temple because she was unclean. And so she's lost her community. Her health is declining. She spent all that she's had on doctors trying to get the help that she needs. And she hears that Jesus is coming through town. And she just thinks to herself, if I can just get there and touch the hem of his garment, I will be clean. That was taking a huge risk, because everyone in town likely would have known who this woman was. And they would likely have been surprised to see her in amongst the crowd of people that were waiting to see Jesus. And as the people were pressing against him, trying to get his attention, and everyone wanting a bit of Jesus' time, she took the risk to just go and touch the hem of his garment. which also put Jesus at risk, because the religious elite at that time, by her touching him, he could have been considered unclean. But she does it. And I love the part in the story where Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And his disciples are like, "Are you kidding me?" It's cleaned up in our translation, but that's what they said. "You've got to be kidding me. All these people are touching you." But there was something different about this woman's touch. She could have crawled away quietly when Jesus asked that question, but she didn't. She stood up and she said, "It was me." And Jesus said, "Your faith has made you whole." Now, I'm going to tell you, and for any clergy in here, you can back me up, this is a dangerous story when it comes to bad theology. It is a dangerous story because there are people who believe if you're not healed, you just don't have enough faith. And I grew up in such a tradition. And it was the custom in the church that I grew up in for there to be a question box in the narthex. And people could drop in any question that they wanted to. And once a month, the pastor would draw a question out of the box. And he would answer that question in one of his Sunday evening sermons. One time, somebody asked the question, "Why do some people receive healing and others don't?" Now, the most pastoral answer he could have given to that would have been, "I don't know." But instead, he used that story, and he said sometimes people don't get the healing they're looking for because they don't have enough faith. And sitting over in the next section was one of the most precious people I'd ever met in my life who was dealing and living with leukemia. Probably the most godly person I'd ever met in my life. And we had been praying for the longest time for her healing to come, and it did not. And he just told this woman, "You don't have enough faith." That's what makes this story in the wrong hands very dangerous. Because everybody that we know, and I'm willing to say that everybody in this room right now, is fighting a battle that nobody else knows anything about. And many of us have been praying for a long time to be healed from that. And the healing hasn't come. At least it hasn't come the way that we think it should look. And in the wrong hands, that story can make it seem like we have a problem of faith. When, friends, the answer to the question of why some people have healing and others don't is a very complex answer. And to simplify it, if you ask me, I'm going to tell you I don't know. Because I don't. But I often wonder in that story if this woman who was hoping that if she could just get to Jesus, that hope is what kept her going day after day after day. Maybe that's what brings about the healing for us, is our hope. Maybe what brings about the healing that may look different than what I'm expecting it to look like may be the goodness and the kind-heartedness of our friends and our neighbors. Maybe the healing that we're looking for may be simply a place for somebody to sit and just be. Because every day we meet people who we have no idea what they're facing and what they're living with. We can bring them a little bit of hope by being kind, maybe even by listening to their story. I don't know if I've shared with you, If I have, just pretend you've never heard it before. But I have lived with depression for my entire life. And there are good days and there are bad days. And through therapy, I have worked my way through how to live with something that I have prayed would go away years and years and years ago. Sometimes the simplest act of kindness when I am having an episode, sometimes the simplest act of kindness is somebody just sitting with me and not saying a word. It's hard for me. But just sitting and listening. And I learned that from a 7-year-old boy. When I was a counselor, working on my social work degree, I was a counselor at a place called the Healing Place. And it was an organization that helped support children who had lost a loved one. And once a year, we would have the Healing Hearts Day Camp, where everybody that was in the program came together for this big event. And we would share, they would share their grief, they would share their joy, they would share their memories. And in the course of that day, I'm looking over and I see 2 boys that were in the program sitting on the steps, and one is sobbing uncontrollably. And I go over as the adult thinking, I'm the counselor, I'm going to help these 2 boys. And so I go over there and ask if there's anything I can do. And this 7-year-old boy has his arm around his friend who is sobbing, and he looks up at me and he says some of the most powerful words I think I've ever heard in my life. He said, "Nope, I'm just helping my friend cry." And sometimes that's all we need for healing. It's certainly not for somebody to tell us we don't have enough faith. It's certainly not for somebody to tell us to pray harder. Sometimes it's just to provide a shoulder to cry on, and a simple understanding that healing looks different for each and every person. I invite you now into a time of silent reflection, but during this time of silent reflection, think about the number of ways in your life that maybe you need healing. Or maybe the ways and the times in your life that you have found healing, but it looked a little different than what you thought it would look like.